Our fourth speaker is Debbie Eisenbise, and I hope I say the name correctly. She's an end-of-life doula, and she partners with Jane Gibbons. Who is a retired nurse. They have Through the Threshold end-of-life doula services, and they also offer advanced care planning with those services. And Debbie is also a spiritual director and ordained minister and consultant for home funerals and green burials. She lives in Kalamazoo with her librarian husband and cat, and her daughter as well goes to U of M and visits as well. So if you want to come up, please.
Nice to be here today and to talk a little bit about work with families. I should begin by saying that Jane and I, when we began working as end-of-life doulas, really didn't know exactly where this would go. An end-of-life doula can be just a vigiler at the bedside, or can be someone who comes in and walks your dog and does your laundry for you and accompanies your family in that way and fills in with the domestic needs in the home. But Jane and I wanted to do kind of the big picture planning. And what we found is that in doing this work, that invariably what we do is we get into the middle of conversations with families. Because Hillary will go and talk to people and she'll give them these pieces of paper and say you need to do your advanced care planning. She went to a Rotary meeting not too long ago, and we showed up 3 months afterwards and said, you remember Hillary who gave you those pieces of paper? And they all nodded. And we said, so did you do them? And they looked at each other. And the thing is that families have a hard time coming together around end-of-life decision-making. Families have a hard time talking to each other. And what we found is that when we walk in the room, it changes the dynamic. And that we can help to facilitate those conversations. Because sometimes the dynamics in families are such that there's just certain things we don't talk about, or certain things we'd rather not talk about. Or, well, we'll talk to mom and dad about this, but we can't do it in front of so-and-so because so-and-so gets so emotional about it. You know, we'd bring it up at Thanksgiving, but it would turn everyone's stomach. No one would have any turkey, whatever it is in our family. And so we have a hard time talking about end of life. And so what we try to do is facilitate those conversations, get everybody talking, and kind of normalize this. You know, this is a hard thing for people, and yet this is where we're all headed. So one of the things that we want people to remember is that we're born to die. That as soon as we are born, we are dying. Maybe we can think of it as a tree. Okay, so you have a tree and it's planted and it grows and it leaves out in the middle of summer, and then it starts to produce fruit. Right? That's what it's meant to do. It's meant to produce fruit. Well, what happens? Does it hold on to that fruit? Does it even hold on to the leaves, right? There's a time that comes for letting go. So if we look at the stages of life, we look at someone in the early stages of life being, well, it's really mimicry, isn't it? It's learning by mimicking. It's learning by observing. And then the second stage of life is really commitment. You commit to doing something, to producing that fruit. But then the next stage of life comes, and it's a stage where what we're doing is moving toward letting go. We're moving toward taking that fruit, letting it come in all of its juiciness into ripeness, and then letting it fall, letting it go. Because it's only when the fruit falls that the seeds that are in it can take root. It's only when the leaves fall out of that tree that all the nourishment that is in them can go into the ground for the next generation. And we are here not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. So our last speaker spoke about leaving a legacy. Leaving a legacy is incredibly important. And sometimes we just think of it in terms of material wealth, or passing on a house, or the car, or, well, the dog, or the bird, or the turtle, or whatever our pet is, passing on a thing. But it's also passing on who we are, what we've invested in, what's important to us. It's passing on the recipes. It's passing on how to cook. It's passing on how to sew. It's passing on woodworking. It's passing on what we have invested into the next generation. It's passing on the wisdom that we have learned, what we have learned in our lives, to the next generation, so that we can progress as a world in our common good. And the only way progress has ever been made is that people in the past have passed on what they've learned to people in the present, who have passed it on to people in the future, and we've built upon it. But this was easier, I think, back in the time when winter came and we all hunkered down and sat around the fire inside, right? There was nothing to do but tell those stories, tell the stories of the family, tell the legends, teach one another the songs, teach one another the skills, teach one another. We don't do that anymore. Families are scattered. They're all over the place. And it's difficult. We heard from our second speaker today about how they have to track down family members, right, to know who is going to be responsible for that person who is now vulnerable or incapacitated. This is one of the things that is so hard. I do a lot of weddings. I've been ordained 30 years, so my husband says I've married more people than he even knows. But when we're talking before the wedding, and we're talking in premarital counseling, and we get to the place where I say to them, you know you are now legally responsible for this other person. When you get married, the responsibility moves from the parents to you. What are you going to do in case of closed head injury? What are you going to do when there's a stroke? What are you going to do when there's an accident? Do you know each other's wishes in terms of death? They don't want to talk about it. Their life is just beginning, right? But that's where the rubber hits the road. My sister was married at age 23 to a man she had known through college. They had been married 18 months and he dropped over dead. He had a congenital heart disease, actually. It came down through the family. They didn't know. They ran autopsy after autopsy, and then they finally found out that this was a genetic thing in the family. And so then, of course, the nephews and the others got tested, and it turned out that if you did certain things nutritionally and medically when you were in adolescence, you could prevent this sudden death. But he just dropped over dead. I mean, this happens. Nobody expects it, right? And what do we do in those moments? How do we respond? We're not prepared. Now, we can get prepared. We've talked here some about advanced directives. We've talked here some about advanced decision-making. You can do that, and it needs to be done, not only once, but it needs to be revisited again and again and again. And furthermore, if you are in any way estranged from your family, or you are away geographically from your family, you need to surround yourself with a family of choice, people who will be responsible for you, and you can make them responsible through paperwork. You can. Now, mind you, it's very important if you do this, that if you make someone, for instance, power of attorney, that you also fill out funeral representative paperwork, because at your death, they are no longer responsible. So if you have no one in your life and you have died, you become an unclaimed body. You go to the morgue, and again, they begin this process of looking for your family, looking for these people with whom you have a connection. We are born into this world, into a family, whether we know it or not. And unless you are adopted by a family and gone through a legal process, The people who you are connected to by blood are your people, whether you like them or not. So I know a man right now who is in the hospital and he is incapacitated, cannot make decisions, and they had to track down family. They tracked down an ex-wife who is not legally divorced from him and an estranged daughter. Those are the people making the decisions for him. I'm not sure that's what he wants. So family, we need to think about in a very kind of basic way is how society and how the government thinks about family, who we're actually related to. Then we need to think about, well, what are the choices we want to make in terms of drawing family around us, people who will be responsible for us in the case of debilitation, in the case of death. And how are we communicating this? And how are we documenting this? And how are we letting people know over time our wishes? And how are we there at the moment of death? And how are we with those people? And I think it comes down to this, that when it comes to the actual dying, we need to ourselves think about how are we loving people for the people who consider us family? And how are we encouraging those around us to be loving of us? It's hard because none of us wants to be vulnerable. None of us wants to be weak. And we're afraid of being vulnerable and weak. We don't like people seeing us in those circumstances. But love carries over, and love continues, and love is a powerful, powerful thing. And it is so very necessary. One reason it's necessary is because when we're dealing with families, we're dealing with intergenerational groups. And I do not agree with what my mother's wishes are right now. I will tell you that. And I do not agree with what my father's wishes were, and my father died about a year ago. And yet, I love them, and I need to respect them. And so, this is part of what it means to be family. So my parents' wishes are these. My father and mother decided when it comes to the end of life, 3 doctors will agree and will tell them when it's enough and that it will be time. 3 doctors. Who are these 3 doctors? Well, they don't know, but 3 doctors. They're of the older generation who doesn't take control and doesn't feel like they can make the decisions. Only the doctors, whoever these doctors are, can make this decision. Well, I was pleased that it only came down to 1 doctor in the long run, but the 3 were what was stated. My father went into the hospital on Wednesday before Thanksgiving. His own doctor, the one that really mattered in the long run, was of course not available until Monday. My mother would not really make decisions until she talked to him, until she got his okay. And I honestly think if that man had said, keep that your husband alive, she would have done it. Do whatever you need to do, even though they said they didn't want extraordinary measures. He goes into the hospital. He goes in because there's a fall. My mother wants him checked out. He's checked out. He's fine, except that he has pneumonia. They begin aggressively treating him for pneumonia. They find out the reason he has pneumonia is he's been aspirating food. Why is he aspirating food? He can't swallow. So at the point that my sister and I really become involved 2 days in, they're treating him for the pneumonia. And the ear, nose, and throat doctor comes in to begin therapy to reteach him how to swallow. He's 90 years old. He's malnourished. He's frail. His kidneys are giving out. He's dying. And yet she's going to do this because it's the protocol. So we say to her, because we know there's palliative care, can we see someone in palliative care? She would not have mentioned that. Right? Because it's still a failure. Death is a failure. And we have these protocols, and we have these things we do, and we go through these things because it's what we do. even though we asked her, well, what's the likelihood? And it was like this, that it's really going to work. So she looked relieved, brought in the palliative care, and we began talking about non-curative care. And at that point, I was very sad because while I knew my dad was now on the way to death and he was not going to have a lot of pain, I also knew that he was probably going to die of kidney failure, and he could have died of pneumonia. That was known as the old man's mercy in years gone by. They could have let him go, but instead 2 days more in, the pulmonologist shows up at my father's bed telling him how great his lungs look. I walked out with him, I said, he's dying of renal failure. He said, yeah, but his lungs look great. This happens all the time because the medical profession has so specialized and kind of dissected the human being that we don't see the whole. The family can see the whole. The family loves that person. I love my dad, not just his lungs. I loved all of him. And we can be there with them, advocating for them, and giving them permission to die. We spend a lot of time in our life thinking about wellness. A good death is part of living well. And we can do that. And we can do it for our families.